he actually collaborated with David Sinclair and others in the pioneering days of bringing science to the treatment of AUD, primarily by understanding the stress response of mammals and endorphins. He was able to eventually link this to alcohol consumption after the stress passed, and this led to the idea of using an opioid antagonist to block the receptors, which we now know are part of alcohol reward chain. And this led to the first human trials of naltrexone and approval by the FDA. And the gentleman that was instrumental in getting that happen is here today to tell us a bit how that happened. And we're really quite excited about that. Dr. Volpicelli, you have a wonderful Italian name. I've told you that, but cumbersome. So you and I have settled on Joe, and I assume that's good for other people asking the question.
Joe is perfectly fine. That sounds great. So,
Excellent. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I want to just go through a couple of quick housekeeping things because this is an 8-part series. So the first thing is to maximize your viewing pleasure. What we suggest you do is go up to the right-hand corner and make sure your view individually is set to speaker. That's the button up on the upper right-hand corner for each of you. And these sessions are going to be recorded, but only the two of us will be visible. Your voice, however, would be recorded. So if you want to pose a question and you don't want your voice recorded, just let us know that in the chat. We do expect that the series is going to run about 8 parts. It could go longer, it could go shorter. It just depends on the level of interest. And if it goes on longer, that's great. What we want is a lot of interaction and questions. This is a unique opportunity to ask one of the world's top addiction specialists about our particular world. So you can just put your questions in the chat. We'll monitor those. We'll open up the mic so you can ask the questions. We're probably not going to be able to go into too much of a deep dive on individual cases just because of the time. But we'll make note of those. And even if necessary, I'm willing to have a regular TSM meetup after this. The last thing I'd like to say is, although Joe is a practicing doctor, there's nothing in this series that you should consider that he is giving you medical advice on, because he would have to examine you first before he'd be able to do that. So this is general professional advice, but not to you specifically. So with that, what I'd like to do is ask you, Joe, if you could tell us a little bit about your history with naltrexone, your original early studies. You started in University of Pennsylvania as a medical doctor, and then on into PhD in psychology, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how about sketching us that?
Yeah, all right. So thank you for your introduction. That sounds good on my Wikipedia page, but I want to introduce me and who I am. And I want to start off by saying that I've had a long interest in the interaction between biology and behavior. And even though I don't have any personal history of addiction myself, this is something that I've been really interested in for a lot of years. And let me tell you the story of how I got interested in it. In 1975, I joined the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. And that year, I was accepted into the Medical Scientist Training Program, the MSTP program, in which I was going to get an MD degree and also a PhD degree in psychology. So I was going to be a scientist clinician. And I was working in Marty Seligman's lab doing learned helplessness research with rats. And as part of the research, I found, and maybe we'll talk about this later during the course of this semester, some of the research I did with the rats that included not only learned helplessness, but its opposite called learned mastery. But while I was doing research with this, I was trying to understand why rats drink alcohol. And one of the things I reasoned is that it's when people are stressed, it turns out one of the most important variables is how much people can control the stress, not the stressor per se, but if you have control over it. And in the field, there's a lot of conflicting data about how stress could affect alcohol drinking. And I reasoned if I did an experiment where I gave rats either controllable or uncontrollable stress, then I could really determine how stress affects drinking. So I did an experiment, and sure enough, I found that the rats that had the uncontrollable stress, electric foot shock, drank more alcohol than the rats who didn't have uncontrollable stress. And I said, oh, see, the stress response, the reason why rats find alcohol rewarding is because of the tension reduction hypothesis, that it reduces the tension. But I had a undergraduate student working with me who looked at the data and he said, why is it that the rats drink the alcohol, not the days that they get the stress, but like a day or two later? I said, I don't know, some sort of delayed reaction. So I just buried that for a little bit. And then I did a rotation at the VA where I was at the VA hospital. I did a rotation and I had a patient who was a Vietnam veteran. This is way back in 1975. And he had problems with alcohol. He was addicted to alcohol. And I was a young medical student, pretty confident in myself, just got awarded the MSTP program. And we were on rounds one day. And so the attending doctor was there, the residents were there, a couple other medical students, and I got to present his case. And I said, this person, from the stress of the Vietnam War experience, developed alcohol addiction. He's probably drinking to reduce his tension. And just as I was presenting the case, the guy turned around and punched me. He just smacked me. And turned out he was having withdrawal symptoms. He had DTs. Well, as we left the room, he was brought out in 4-point restraint and taken away. And I realized that he actually gave me a good wake-up call, that here I thought I knew something about addiction and alcohol addiction, and I really didn't. And when he recovered from his DTs, we talked a lot, and he really taught me an awful lot about this phenomenon. I decided I was going to really try to study it and understand it. And one of the things that he told me was that when he was in Vietnam, he used to shoot up heroin like a lot of the people there. But when he came back from Vietnam, he wasn't able to get access to the heroin, and he started using alcohol. And he found that the alcohol sort of hit the spot, and that was interesting. Then I was familiar with this research that you may have heard of by this guy named David Sinclair. And it's not the research that you're thinking of. This is a study he did where he gave rats morphine. And he found that when he gave the rats morphine, he could suppress alcohol preference. But when the morphine wore off, the alcohol drinking increased. And I was wondering, how is it then that when you're stressed, my rats wouldn't drink the alcohol, but they drank alcohol after the stress? When you get morphine, you don't increase your alcohol drinking. You might even decrease your alcohol drinking. But when the morphine wears off, that's when you enjoy alcohol. And I began to put together a story that the alcohol is rewarding not so much because it reduces stress or tension, but because there's something after the stress that increases the desire to want to drink. And at that time, there's also research being done to show that for some people, when they drink, the alcohol stimulates endogenous opiates. And I thought, well, if you're in opiate withdrawal from using heroin, getting morphine, or maybe even exposure to uncontrollable stress, then the alcohol would be particularly reinforcing after the stress. You're basically in withdrawal from your own endogenous opiates. And so that was the thesis that I proposed, the endorphin compensation hypothesis. And then I studied that phenomenon. And I reasoned that I should be able to block post-stress drinking in rats by blocking their opiate receptors. The alcohol would no longer be rewarding. So I did the study in rats, and I found that sure enough, the rats who got placebo injections, they increased their alcohol drinking after stress, just like the other rats. But the rats that got the naltrexone, where we blocked their opiate receptors, they did not show the post-stress increases in alcohol drinking. And that was all part of my dissertation. And so in 1981, I graduated from the MD PhD program. I did a year of internship at Allentown. And when I came back to Penn, I came back as a resident in psychiatry. And I had negotiated with the department. I said, I really want to do some research. I know I'm going to be a resident, but please let me do some research. And they let me do that. And so by 1983, I started doing the study at the VA hospital with the help of Chuck O'Brien, Dr. O'Brien. And we did a study in humans, in veterans, in which we gave people either placebo or naltrexone after they detoxed. And we wanted to look at what percent of people would go back to drinking, any drinking. But we did a couple other things that were sort of novel. The thesis was that the naltrexone wouldn't necessarily help you not have the first drink, but by blocking the reward from the alcohol, you wouldn't enjoy the alcohol so much, so you would stop drinking after one or two drinks. And sure enough, when we did the study, what we found was that for folks who got placebo, if you had a slip, basically all of them went on to meet the criteria for relapse, which is 5 or more drinks. But for the folks who had naltrexone in their system, only about half the people who had a slip went on to have a period where they had a heavy drinking day, where they had 5 or more drinks. And so I was so excited when I saw those results, and I went and blabbed it to everyone. And so one of the persons who I blabbed it to was this guy who was doing research with rats, and his name was David Sinclair, and he actually was at a conference where I was invited to give a talk on the preliminary results from this study. And he heard the results, and he I guess he was impressed by it. And later he came to our center and we talked about it. And he says, "This is great. You blocked the reinforcing properties of alcohol. You know what? He did actually patent the idea of using naltrexone to extinguish alcohol drinking. And it's, of course, known as the Sinclair method. And he actually got a patent to study that and to look at it. Now, one of the things that was, we had discussions early on was that, did you really need to detoxify the people first before doing extinction? And we sort of had some disagreements about that, and we can talk about some of that later. But the point is that in the early days, David Sinclair, myself, and other people who were in the field, people really didn't believe our results. They did not believe that alcohol had something to do with endogenous opiates. And so it wasn't a very popular idea. It was rejected pretty much out of hand. But then there was a group at Yale led by Stephanie O'Malley that did the same study where they used naltrexone, and they found virtually identical results. And because at Yale and Penn, we both found the same results, then people began to take these studies seriously. And we went to the company, we got the company to submit an IND to the FDA to get the medicine approved. And again, that's an interesting story in and of itself, but we actually got the FDA to approve naltrexone, but it was approved conditionally. It didn't go through all the fancy regulatory processes that most drugs go through. And the study was done, a small study done at Penn, small study done at Yale, as opposed to a large, big double-blind placebo-controlled studies that they do now to test medicines. But they said, this is such an important tool to help people with addiction. We need to get it out there. And they also told the company, if you wind up selling like $10 million worth of this medicine, then we want you to go back and do like a real study. Well, it turned out the company, DuPont, never really reached that threshold, so no one ever did the big study. But the point is, by 1994, the FDA approved naltrexone, and it's been around for nearly 30 years, and it's still not being used very much. And so one of the reasons why I'm here tonight is to see if we can get the word out about this very important medicine and see if we can help people.
Exactly. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. One of the questions that's comes up all the time is this prescribing it on a daily basis, okay, as opposed to on a targeted basis. And as I understand that from speaking with you, that's a result of the fact that all these studies weren't done at that time, that it was kind of sidetracked or fast tracked, let's call it that, as an orphan drug, right? I think that's what the term is.
It's an orphan drug. So they have a category where they can fast track medicines for disorders which they think they're not going to sell a lot of the medicine for it. And so the criteria for getting it through the FDA is a little bit easier. And so it got the orphan drug status. And also naltrexone itself had been already approved to treat opiate use disorder in 1984. And so the company wanted to have some degree of exclusivity for its alcohol indication. And so the FDA tried to work together with the pharmaceutical company to get the medicine out there.
Okay. And so, of course, under the Sinclair method, it's more targeted approach. And so that's just a common question that people come up with, or even, a complaint almost, if you will. And so I think it's important that folks understand the history of that while it might not be perfectly prescribed in a targeted manner, and we're working on that, the fact is, if it hadn't been fast-tracked as an orphan drug, we wouldn't even have it.
That's right. I mean, when I work with the veterans, many of them had pretty severe alcohol addiction. And so routinely, when they first came into treatment, the first phase of treatment was to help detoxify them. We actually came up with protocols to detoxify them in an ambulatory setting. And so we had people go through detoxification first before we even invited them into the study. I'm sure I would not have gotten approval to even do the study if I suggested that we could get these veterans and put them on naltrexone without detoxifying them. So part of the tradition of detoxifying people first was based on what was practical, what I was able to actually do. And the other thing with the FDA, I have to say, is that when they look at outcome measures to assess if a medicine is useful or not to treat alcohol addiction, they're always looking for things like what % of people are abstinent on the medicine. And so it was tough to convince them that any drink should not be the criteria, but if they had a episode of heavy drinking, 5 or more drinks in one day, would be a better criteria to use. And with some talking with them, we're able to sort of convince them to use that as the outcome measure. But from the very beginning, there's always been this dichotomy of either you're drinking and you're doing poorly, or you're completely abstinent. And one of the things that we tried to do in our study was to say, no, that there's different degrees of outcomes, and we shouldn't just look at one drink equals a failure.
Exactly. And that's actually a perfect segue into this little thing that I want to share here, which is really, what are the objectives? What are we trying to do here with this 8-part series? Okay. And we've spent a lot of time preparing it. I think that we've come to the conclusion right from the get-go. You said that you wanted folks to understand not just the facts, but also to understand the underlying mechanisms and the tools, so that they're able to guide their own recovery. The focus then will be exactly what you started on just now, destroying some of these myths, destroying some of these preconceived notions about how things have to be done. And the first one probably to be destroyed is the idea that there's a one-size-fits-all solution, that each individual probably needs their own tailored approach. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. So the focus is learning and unlearning addiction. The objective is for everybody out there who has an AUD, or a person that they're concerned about that may have AUD, is that there's an ability now to exercise our own agency. And this is a reflection really of the failure of the healthcare industry to deal with this, and not just in the United States, but worldwide. I just read something today about a person trying to pursue TSM in the UK, and it was virtually impossible for that person. And it's the fact is, it is something that people can learn. They can handle it themselves. And so it's time to take control of our own recovery. And then afterwards, to understand the process so well, to have been so successful implementing it, that we're able to teach others and get this to become the normal way of treatment, not some far out thing. And so what we have planned is okay. So one final note is that we really think that we've got to change things at a grassroots level. I mean, we have to work top down and bottom up, but we really have to change the way things are done. And this is part of that effort. So the schedule that we've outlined is, and we're going to go into today here right next, is what is AUD? The next will be neuroplasticity and learning. Neuroplasticity underlines pretty much everything that we're doing, including the pharmacological extinction using the Sinclair method, but also the psychosocial therapies that are necessary in learning. We'll go into the neurobiology of addiction, the learning and how it causes addiction, psychosocial models and tools, and then how do we change? How do we take all this information and go out there and change the way the world views this, and the way that the world views us, the way that the world views a problem, and the way that the world makes resources available to solve the problem. There's, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but 30 million people in the United States alone that have AUD.
Mm-hmm.
Of that, you told me a staggeringly small number that used medication. Was it like 28,000? It was less than a half. It was so small, I couldn't even see it with a microscope. What was it?
28,000 people are on one of the FDA-approved medicines to treat AUD.
That's what I thought. 28,000. So we have 30 million people in the United States alone. Of that, 3 million probably get any kind of attention. And of that, 28,000 are using one of three medications, really two, because one of them is not really a good medication. I think we'll get into that. One for dealing with this issue. So it's appalling. And we're going to change that. That's the purpose here. So with that, I think we'll just get into lesson number one. Tee that up. All right, Dr. Volpicelli. Joe,
All right, so
it's all yours.
all right, Steve. So you'll control the slides then?
I will.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
So let's go back to the title slide.
All right.
Yeah. So the title of today's seminar, if you will, is what is alcohol addiction? And I think the theme is best described by the phrase, the drink takes a drink. Next slide. And that phrase actually comes from an ancient Japanese proverb. First, the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, then the drink takes the man. And the picture on the right-hand side is actually from 1939, which, oops, can we go back?
Sorry. Yep, sorry.
Yep. In which they talk about that Japanese proverb and how this pattern chains the person, traps the person in this addictive cycle. And it's hard to read, so I outlined it on the left-hand side, but the text under the picture says, it is much easier, we are told, to resist the first glass of liquor than the second. The presence of alcohol in the mouth awakens a craving for more. I think this proverb and that text describes what addiction is probably better than any model that we're taught today. And I think that says it all. But let me go through that for a little bit. Next slide. There we go. So in terms of professionally defining addiction, it really starts in 1952, where the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM, attempted to describe or at least label all the psychiatric disorders. And they basically defined psychiatric disorders into two classes: those that had a clear organic pathology, like Alzheimer's disease, something that you could see under a microscope, or you could see if you dissected the brain, and those conditions which were of psychogenic origin or without any clearly defined tangible cause or structural change. And so they had various categories of these kind of psychogenic disorders. And under the heading of the sociopathic personality disturbance, the X60, X60, you had the antisocial reaction. Everything was a reaction in those days. You had the dissocial reaction. And then you had sexual deviation. And then you would subclassify that by the kind of sexual deviation. And I didn't list all the sexual deviations, and I think you would be sort of surprised or disappointed to see what they were. And I won't embarrass the DSM folks from 1952, but we wouldn't really classify those as disorders anymore. But under that, you had addiction with two subheadings. You could be addicted to alcohol, which is alcoholism, or you could be addicted to drug or drug addiction. So addiction was in the subheading of sociopathic personality disturbance. That's what people thought about addiction in those days. And that was sort of the feeling at the time, and the feeling in which AA emerged, that people thought of addiction as some sort of deviancy, some sort of sociopathic personality. Who else would abuse alcohol? And that was the feeling at the time. Can I have the next slide? So in 1968, they revised the DSM, and it became the DSM Roman numeral II. And at that point, they divided psychiatric disorders into those that had organic pathology and those that had a psychogenic pathology. And of the psychogenic pathologies, you could either have a psychotic disorder or a neurotic disorder or neuroses. And so alcoholism fit under the neuroses category. And so here the term alcoholism is used, and you could have episodic excessive drinking, habitual excessive drinking, alcohol addiction, or other. So there's sort of three categories, or other. Next slide. In 1980, there was a dramatic transformation in terms of classification for psychiatric disorders. At this point, instead of just labeling them, they wanted to come up with a way of really identifying people. And so they came up with what characteristics do the disorder have, and what do you need to really get the diagnosis? So it wasn't just based on clinical impression, it was tried to be based on real clinical facts. And in those days, you could have alcohol abuse, which was a pattern of pathological use, inability to cut down or stop drinking, impairment in social functioning, or disturbance. And you had to have the disturbance of at least 1 month. So you had the inability to cut down and impairment in social occupational functioning, and it had to be of 1 month duration. But then they had alcohol dependence. And to get alcohol dependence, you needed to have basically abuse, and you had to have tolerance or withdrawal. So dependence was really referring to sort of the physical dependence that people have to alcohol. So there's alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence. And that's how they defined all addictions, the addiction to cocaine, addiction to opiates, that there was abuse category, impaired control and psychosocial consequences. And then to get dependence, you had to have tolerance or withdrawal. Now, in the 1980s, one of the drugs that was very popular was cocaine. And that presented a problem for our diagnostic scheme because there wasn't really much of a withdrawal reaction to cocaine. So it looked just like dependence, but there was no withdrawal. So they had to sort of revise that. And so the DSM-4 in the next slide. So yeah, in 1994, the DSM-4 came out where they really tried to get away from using dependence, physical dependence, tolerance or withdrawal as a defining characteristic of addiction. And they still had two categories. There was alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence. And the abuse referred to basically a mild form of addiction that basically, if you used a substance and it caused psychosocial problems for you, you had abuse. They thought most people who had really addiction or alcohol dependence, they called it, so they got rid of the term alcoholism, they called it dependence. That basically was a pattern of use in which you had a need to you needed to use more of the alcohol to get the same effect. So you had tolerance, or you had a withdrawal, or you had some of these other variables like you use it in larger amounts. You had trouble controlling how much you used. It had biopsychosocial problems associated with you, so that there were 7 categories, and you needed to have 3 or more of these. So why 3 or more? There was the issue of if someone took opiates for pain, was prescribed opiates for pain, they would get tolerance and withdrawal to that. But they didn't want to say those folks were addicted. So what was happening in 1994? Remember, that was the time when the medical profession was really interested in dealing with pain. It was the 5th cardinal sign. And so some companies that you may have heard of, like Purdue, were really pushing this notion that doctors need to be more aggressive with treating pain. And so if you had tolerance or withdrawal to an opiate, they didn't want to give you the diagnosis of alcohol dependence or abuse. They said that was just healthy use. So a lot of people then became physically dependent on opiates, and that was fine. So they wanted to make sure you had to have 3 or more of the categories to really come up with the diagnosis of dependence. So that was 1994, and in so in 2013, the DSM-5 came out, and that was dramatically different. But first, if you look at it, there's like 11 different symptoms, and you need to have 2 or more. So they got rid of the whole notion of abuse and addiction or dependence, because when they looked at the data, they found that a lot of people who had abuse wound up just evolving into dependence anyway. And the other thing they did that was really important is, for the first time, they had the word craving as one of the clinical characteristics. So this is the official way to diagnose, to describe what an alcohol addiction is. Those 11 categories, and you need to have 2 or more at the same time during the same 12-month period.
So
Now,
let me just recap this a second and see if I understand this. So
sure.
way back in the 1950s, it was basically you're kind of crazy sort of thing if you've got an alcohol problem. Okay, it was or you got it, you're really just sick. And then it's progressed to get finer and finer cutoffs of what it is that a person exhibits in terms of behaviors and so on and so forth. And so it's in an attempt, I guess, to link behaviors and dependencies and so forth. What they've done, it seems to me, is make something really complicated.
Yeah. So that when I, tell people what an AUD is and try to describe it, I have a hard time in one elevator ride to get through the 11 different characteristics.
Exactly.
So and so if you're sitting around trying to talk to family members or peers or whatever, and they ask you what AUD is, number one, it's hard to remember, and 2, you don't have enough time to go through all the different characteristics of it.
Right.
So what I maintain is this DSM-5 really comes down to three dimensions that really get at what addiction is and what alcohol use disorder is. And I don't know, is that on the next slide?
Yeah, it should.
Oh,
No,
okay, I'm sorry. So before we get there, I want to point out that one of the really good things that the DSM-5 did do, though, is that instead of looking at addiction as a either or, and I think a lot of people in society see that if an alcoholic is somebody whose life is turned to crap, they have physical withdrawal symptoms, their life is unmanageable, they've hit rock bottom, and other people who drink don't have that, and that's perfectly fine. Well, it turns out if you look at the health consequences from excessive drinking, it doesn't fit into a just a our normal concept of alcoholism versus okay drinking, but there's a whole continuum. And so one of the things that DSM-5 did was they really helped point that out, that you could have mild symptoms, 2 or 3 symptoms, you could have moderate symptoms or severe symptoms. And so it's important that when you make the diagnosis, you identify where the person is along the spectrum. And I actually wrote a paper recently to say that there are people who drink in a problematic way, in an unhealthy way, that don't even meet any of the criteria for the DSM-5, but they're drinking in a unhealthy way that can cause problems for them, could put them at risk for becoming addicted to alcohol, or they're just drinking too much that it's physically unhealthy for them, and they don't realize that the amount that they're drinking is not healthy. So I think there's even categories of, if you look at healthy drinking versus unhealthy drinking, even among people who don't meet the whole full criteria for an alcohol use disorder. So the whole thing is a continuum.
Right. And it's important, I guess, to understand where a person is on the continuum, because while it doesn't dictate their treatment, it certainly has a great influence on what the solution might look like for that particular person.
Yeah, and I think over the course of these this semester, if you will, we're going to find that, you know, someone with mild, the treatment may look different from someone with severe. And within a person, someone might start out with severe AUD, and over time and with effective treatment, it moves into the moderate range or the mild range. So different people require different treatments, and within one person over time, the best approach to help them may also vary as they move along the spectrum. So you want the right treatment for the right person at the right time.
Right. Now, what we really see, though, out there in the real world is the term still alcoholic. And there's a couple points here to talk about. One is, and people probably think I'm a bit pedantic about this, but I really think that the language we use is quite important, because the language that's currently being used around alcohol use disorders, and particularly around treatments, is language that's being dictated to us by the healthcare industry and the insurance companies and the regulators and everybody else. And the implications are really quite enormous. Let's just talk about the one big question we always get asked isn't, where am I on the alcohol use disorder or alcohol use disorder spectrum, but am I an alcoholic? That's the question. Okay. And the reason for that question isn't so much the need to understand yes or no. It's about what the consequence of that answer is, or it's about what the perceived consequences are. So there's this idea that if you're an alcoholic, it's binary, yes or no. And the consequence of being on the wrong side of that answer, the no, is you don't get to have any more fun. You don't get to drink any more, forced abstinence. And on the other side, it's you know, if you're not an alcoholic, you can do whatever you want, have a good time, and you're normal and you're a strong person, and so on and so forth. Okay. And so the question that people that really truly have an alcohol use disorder are asking, it's really not the right question. Am I an alcoholic? It's, I believe I might have an alcohol use disorder, and if that's the case, where am I on the spectrum? And if I'm there on the spectrum, back to what you just said, the treatment will be different. And depending on where I move on that spectrum over time, the treatment even will be different for me as an individual, correct?
Mhm.
And so that's why, and things like, you know, rock bottom, when we talk about language, rock bottom, do you have to hit rock bottom? I mean, a lot of studies show that young people counseled early change their drinking behavior.
Yeah,
So,
I think sometimes the way we think about alcohol addiction, we delay treatment for people until they have reached a later stage of development of the disorder. And by understanding the basic concept of what addiction is, we can identify people who are at the very early stages and intervene. So
right.
that's
But
why
we
it's
can,
important to understand what addiction is.
right. But we also can only identify them to the extent that they're willing to be open and honest about the situation. Okay. And under the current sort of spotlight of shame and guilt that's associated with having an alcohol use disorder, that becomes very difficult. People don't want to talk about it. And in fact, it ends up in, like in the case of the UK person that I was referring to earlier, it was going to be all in their medical file and, you know, be questioned. I think the quote that he said is, all I succeeded in doing was putting a stain on my medical record for the rest of my life. Didn't come to any solution. So to the extent possible, you all out there, everybody out there listening, you know, we don't want to use the term alcoholic. It's alcohol use disorder, but more importantly, it's the implication. And the implication is it doesn't have to be forced abstinence. In fact, in many cases, that's counterproductive. And that's what we're going to learn as we go along. You'd like perhaps to say a few words about the diagnostic tools, especially since you developed one of the key ones.
Yeah, so people often ask, how do I know if I'm an alcoholic or have alcohol use disorder? And there's several different ways to diagnose yourself. And one is called the audit, alcohol use disorders identification test. And this is the self-report version, in which there's 10 questions, and you can see what the questions get at. The first 3 questions just ask about how often do you drink and how much you drink when you do have a drinking episode. The 4th question gets at this idea of compulsion or impaired control. The 5th question gets at, does your alcohol drinking cause you to not meet certain expectations in terms of work or home? And then the 6th question really gets at that physical dependence. Are you drinking to not feel bad rather than to feel good? So are you drinking to take away withdrawal or avoid withdrawal? Question 7 asks, do you feel guilty after you drink? Again, consequences. 8 is a question about blackout. So you drink so much that you black out. And questions 9 and 10 also deal with health consequences. So what you see are questions that sort of center around the amount that you drink, if you have impaired control over it, if it's causing consequences with work or with home life, if you feel bad about your drinking, if you're drinking so much that you can black out, if you drink enough that your body has withdrawal if you stop, and other health consequences. Just the next slide. I think we
got ahead of me.
went ahead an extra one.
It's not going backwards for me either. Okay. There we go.
There we go. Yeah. Well, actually, and this is the pen alcohol craving scale, the modified version of it. And I developed this at Penn with Barbara Flannery, and we wanted a scale that was really simple to administer, that people could use in their clinical practice or use at home. and to really get at this idea of craving, which I think is a very important concept, that people who really strongly desire alcohol, that could be a sign that you may be on your way to having a problem with alcohol. And so there's 5 questions in there, and you can see that one question has to deal with how often have you thought about drinking, and you rate that on a 0 to 5-point scale. How strong was your urge to drink at its severest over the course of the week, and how much time do you spend thinking about drinking? And then the 4th question is, if alcohol was in the house, if it was available, how difficult would it be for you to resist drinking? And then the 5th question is just sort of an overall question of, overall, how would you rate your overall craving or urge to drink? Usually it's over a week period of time. And one of the things that we found is it does correlate it with other scales that measure craving, but it did something also very important, that people who scored high on this scale, it predicted who was going to drink over the course of the next couple of weeks. And so, again, someone who's high on this, it's really important that they get the kind of attention that they need to help prevent a slip or relapse. So craving turns out to be a very important concept in terms of identifying where you are in your recovery. What is addiction? So I went through the DSM-5 categories, but other entities have tried to define it in a more simple way to get at sort of what the core concept is. And I wanted to give you a couple of definitions. And so in AA, according to their pamphlet, which was published in 2018, they see alcoholism as it's an illness. Alcoholics cannot control their drinking because they are ill in their bodies and in their minds or emotions. AA believes that if they do not stop drinking, their alcoholism almost always gets worse and worse. The NIAAA, National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, it's ironic that the agency that conducts research and helps fund research uses terms like alcohol abuse and alcoholism, which aren't even in the nomenclature anymore, but whatever. So they define alcohol use disorder as a medical condition characterized by an inability to control or stop drinking despite adverse social, occupational, or health consequences. It encompasses the conditions that some people refer to as alcohol abuse, alcohol dependence, alcohol addiction, and the colloquial term alcoholism. It's considered to be a brain disorder. AUD can be mild, moderate, or severe, and that lasting changes in the brain caused by alcohol misuse perpetuate AUD and make individuals vulnerable to relapse. ASAM, American Society of Addiction Medicine, in 2019 came up with the definition that alcohol addiction is a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. And then there's a fellow that we know, David Sinclair, who said that subsequent research shows that alcohol drinking is a learned behavior. Some individuals, partly for genetic reasons, get so much reinforcement each time they drink and have so many opportunities to drink and get reinforcement that the behavior becomes too strong. They cannot always control their drinking. They cannot just say no, and society calls them alcoholics. And if you look at these definitions, and I don't know if we can do a poll at this time, but the first 3 really look at alcohol addiction as a chronic condition, and there's a sense that you never get better from it. That once you have it, it's sort of laid down. And even if you're not drinking, you're still at risk for going back to drinking because there's relatively permanent changes either in your illness, in your mind or body, or in your brain, that there's, once you're addicted, you have this for the rest of your life. Sinclair's definition is a little bit more optimistic, that it's a learned behavior and can be unlearned. So there's some hope for recovery. So that's how it's sort of different than the traditional models of addiction. But when I look through these various definitions, it's still hard for me to remember the phrasing in an elevator talk, because there's a lot of complicated interactions between brain circuits and genetics and environment, individual's life experience. I mean, that encompasses pretty much everything. And it's not really very specific for addiction. I could say, diabetes involves complex interactions among, hormones and genetics and environment and individual's life experience. It just doesn't capture what the cardinal feature of addiction is. And I would ask you to ask yourself, what would you say the cardinal feature for addiction is?
I know it's coming up on this slide, so
I think Steve has some idea. Let's see.
Oh, dang.
Let's go back.
Yeah, trying.
Okay.
Not having a qual. There we go.
There we go. So basically, addiction involves 3 dimensions. And the first one is the notion of impaired control, or the drink takes a drink. This is the cardinal feature of addiction. This is the addictive process that over time your craving increases, your motivation increases to want to have alcohol or a drug. That you start off in life having desires for your desires for eating, desires for being productive, desires for social interactions, intimacy. But over time, when you get addicted to something, all those normal desires start to get crowded out. They become less important. The most important thing is getting the drug, getting the alcohol. And this impaired control leads to difficulty cutting back or stopping drinking. And it winds up taking a lot of your time. Either you're spent drinking too much or you're recovering from its effects. So it becomes the most important thing in your life. The drink takes a drink. Drinking increases the desire to want to drink more. And what happens for people who are stuck in this drink takes a drink cycle? Well, it leads to psychosocial consequences. The drink takes the person. And that includes failure to take care of home or work responsibilities, continued use despite medical or psychosocial complications from alcohol, little time or energy for other social, work, or recreational activities, and use in dangerous situations such as drunk driving. And then, over time, there's physiologic adaptation to the drug or alcohol, so that the body will go through withdrawal if it doesn't get it, or you get tolerant to it so that you get less of a pharmacological effect from alcohol. So you start out having 5 or 6 drinks, and over time, you need 10 or 12 drinks to get the same effect. That's physiologic adaptation. And so the person the person needs the drink. So the ancient Japanese proverb, they had it right from the beginning. The drink takes a drink, the drink takes the person, and the person needs the drink. And if you think of it in these terms, I think it's something that we could explain to someone on an elevator ride, that it's impaired control, psychosocial consequences, and over time leading to physiologic adaptation. And that's what addiction is. And as we keep this in mind and talk about treatment, the treatment could be aimed at one of those dimensions. Maybe there's something that can help control the impaired control, that can help treat the impaired control over drinking. Maybe there's some kind of treatments that really address some of the psychosocial consequences. And maybe there's mechanisms to help deal with that physiologic adaptation. And so when you think about someone who's addicted to alcohol, you ask yourself the questions, where are they along those 3 dimensions? Next slide. And what I'm going to say now, I think really gets at the core of why some people do not understand what addiction is and why people have addiction, they get it. And if we look at, say, the normal reward cycle, we start off with some sort of motivation to eat or to do something. We start off with the motivation to want to do something, and then we do it. We eat, and then we feel good after we eat. We get the reward. But what happens when we get that reward? It feeds back on the motivation to eat. I love raviolis. Sometimes I'm hungry for my raviolis and I enjoy eating them. But after half a dozen or so raviolis, I'm not so interested in eating raviolis anymore. My motivation to eat decreases. Now, while I'm not addicted to alcohol or any other drug, I can sort of get a sense of what the addictive cycle is like in my relationship with corn chips, and more recently, these little pretzel nuggets that have peanut butter inside. I love those things. And actually, I have to hide them because when I start eating these things, it feels good, but my motivation to eat more of them increases. So it's very different than my motivation around raviolis that I love an awful lot. My motivation decreases over time. And so the addictive cycle is you have the motivation to drink, you drink, then as you drink and you experience the reward from drinking, what happens to the motivation to have the next drink? It increases instead of decreases. So it creates a addictive cycle where engaging in the behavior increases the motivation to do more of it. And that's why I think addiction is a motivational disorder. The motivation increases as a result of engaging in the behavior. And that, for me, is sort of the fundamental cardinal feature of addiction. And consequently, the treatment would be to address this. And here we have the addictive cycle. You use, you feel good when you use, either it takes away withdrawal or unpleasant feelings, or it produces which is negative reinforcement, or it produces a good feeling, positive reinforcement. But when that feeling goes away, you're left with withdrawal symptoms. So you feel lousy again, and that increases your motivation to use more. And so you're stuck in sort of a terrible vicious cycle where use creates the need to use more.
And just to not bring too fine a point on it, but this can actually be happening really rapidly. Like I'm thinking of the in-session drinking, okay, where a person is compulsively drinking, and it's because, as I understand it, I would get the reward immediately from the first drink, and then I'm not feeling so good. I'm not, because I got such a great reward that it's obviously got to come down. And so the antidote for me in that particular case, because I am who I am, would be to have another drink. Okay. And so we see that both in the real short cycle, but also over the longer term. If somebody goes into, let's just say the extreme forced abstinence, okay, and we'll get into this shortly here, but the alcohol deprivation effect as a result of that.
That is a great point, Steve, that I've done research where I had people who were college students who did not have AUD themselves, but they had a strong family history for AUD. And I brought them into a lab and I gave them 3 beers. And after the 3rd beer, I asked them how they felt. And for the people who had the strong family history, after 3 beers, their energy increased and their craving for the 4th drink was higher than their craving for the 1st drink. So I actually got to see that the drink increased the desire to have more drinking. And the people who didn't have a strong family history, they got tired after three beers, and their desire to have the 4th beer was very low. And so
and we're going to see that a lot. That whether you get excited on it or whether it puts you to sleep, as kind of a defining feature here, right?
Yes. Yeah. And if we start thinking about it, we can start to think about what maybe the biochemical mechanisms for these things are. But that's what we observe in the laboratory is one group gets excited and has increased craving, and the other group just gets tired and has less craving.
Okay. And so to treat it, we got to break the cycle.
Treat it, you break the cycle.
And I think, you know, this is just a quick example of what we're really trying to achieve. I mean, I can certainly remember in my lifetime when smoking was considered to be actually even healthy. Okay, you know, there were cigarette ads and everything. And I remember seeing recently where they had in the Senate, they had, I guess, 6 big tobacco representatives, executives, and they pulled them all saying, do you think that that's dangerous? No, it's all good for your health and everything like that. So this is where we're at with alcohol right now. And that should not be misinterpreted that because alcohol doesn't cause a lot of problems for a lot of people, we're not here to spoil their party. What we're talking about is for the people that have an issue. And for the people that have an issue, I mean, the biggest sort of ironic, horrible joke is drink responsibly. I mean, how the hell am I supposed to do that? So you're going to talk a lot about the opposing forces of addiction, and you use, for your metaphor, if you will, a tug of war. Other people use a seesaw. I kind of like your tug of war because it, and we'll get into it, but it allows us to place more resources on either side of that tug of war. And it also allows us to affect the timing, which is really quite important. So I'm going to just zip through this slide because we're going to see this every single class, such that there could even be a final exam question. And the bottom line is that while we'd like to have some wonderful unifying theory or model of addiction, it's not appropriate. It's never going to happen. It's not even appropriate because our salience networks are the things that we see. My salience network is so different from your salience network, and it plays right into this whole thing that even if we're identical twins, it's going to be different. What we're going to talk a lot about is the concept of homeostasis and how important that is, and that comes in this alert, sedate balance that we just talked about. So, and playing into that, we have dopamine on kind of the active and alert side, or serotonin working on more of the relax and chill side. We're going to talk about the glutamate GABA balance, and same thing. We find there again, sort of the wired side is glutamate, the chill side is GABA. Here and now, there, and in the future, and that is really represented, I think, best by this struggle. You know, do I have this drink right now? And I'm supposed to use my brain to tell me I shouldn't have that drink, but I'm going to have that drink anyway because my brain, my limbic, my reptile brain, it wants what it's going to want, and it's going to convince the big brain that what it's doing in the moment is the right thing, hijack it in essence. And again, this excited and inhibited thing. So we're going to talk a lot about that and how it plays into our nervous systems and anxiety. I would say probably the two biggest issues that we hear people dealing with apart from the AUD itself is anxiety and depression. So we'll talk about those things. You might want to talk just a little bit about the difference between compulsive and impulsive behavior and how that translates to having the first drink and the subsequent drinks.
Yeah, so people who engage in compulsive behaviors, it's often that they do something to take away some unpleasant feeling or some unpleasant state that they have, so that they will engage in a repeated behavior until some anxiety or unease goes away. So you do it because more you have to. Impulsive behavior is done because it's something that you want, and you just don't think very much about the consequences. You just do it without, as you say, without considering the consequences, but it's more of a anticipation of something good. And what we find for people with addictions is often the desire for alcohol or a drug starts off impulsively. I like to take those pills over there. I like to have a couple of beers. But then over time, instead of becoming something that you just enjoy doing, it's something that you sort of have to do. That if you don't do it, you just feel really crappy. So you're doing it to take away a negative feeling.
Real quickly, the alcohol deprivation effect. And in this particular slide, I think the most important thing is that what you talked about before with the giving 3 beers to the students that had some kind of family history was reflected in this particular thing, that the rats that were bred specifically to have an affinity towards alcohol suffered more under alcohol deprivation effect. And in a nutshell, alcohol deprivation effect comes from, Joe, how would you explain it to us in the elevator?
Yeah. Well, so actually our friend David Sinclair was the one who discovered this. He gave rats 1 hour of access to alcohol every day versus another group that could drink whenever they wanted to. And what he found was that if you just restricted alcohol drinking to 1 hour a day over time, the rats would increase their alcohol drinking. And we wondered why that's the case. And, it could be, again, after you drink, you get a nice, pleasant effect. When you don't have the alcohol around, then you go through perhaps a little bit of a withdrawal. And then when you introduce the alcohol the next day, you're feeling a little bit crappy, you drink the alcohol, and it just absolutely hits the spot. And so what happens over time is that you like alcohol more and more. And you learn that to take away the crappy feeling, you just redose on the alcohol. But if you have it around all the time, it's like, well, you can just moderate the amount of alcohol that's in your system, and it doesn't have any particularly positive reinforcing effect because there's no need that the alcohol is addressing. There's no withdrawal that you have to take care of. But when you limit access to it, you create a need for it. And by taking away that need by redosing, you reinforce the activity. So that's how I would interpret the alcohol deprivation effect.
And is it fair to say that this is a phenomenon that definitely outlives the physical addiction? That, say, for example, I'm triggered by going by a particular bar or seeing a particular ad for a beer on a hot summer day. Am I getting a little squirt of endorphin that's causing a little squirt of dopamine that's resulting in a craving?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we'll discuss this in subsequent weeks, but when your body anticipates getting a drug or alcohol, you get a little taste of it, but which maybe feels good, but what doesn't feel good is that your body's expecting a full dose of it. And when it doesn't get the full dose, it's disappointed. And you actually feel lousy, that you feel a need to get the full dose. So a little taste of something, a little appetizer can increase the desire to want to eat. I know when I go to a restaurant after a meal, I'm usually full after the meal, and then they come around and they say, do you want any dessert? And usually I say, no, thanks. But then they say, okay, well, here's the dessert menu anyway. Or worse, they come around with a dessert tray. And then, of course, you have to have something. So they're smart enough to know that stimuli associated with your reward can create a need for it that didn't exist before you saw the stimulus.
Right, exactly. And then hand in hand with that is this next one, the abstinence violation effect. Okay, which is psychological response to the relapse within the relapse, okay, which is a lot of words, but what it really fundamentally means, I think everybody out there knows it as the effort effect. Okay, if I succumb to alcohol deprivation effect and have some drinks, I might as well have as many drinks as I want to have, because screw it, I've blown it, right? And so this is a real phenomenon. And the way out of this, the therapy for it, let's put it that way, I guess, really is to help the person to understand that there shouldn't be any shame or guilt associated with this, number one. Okay, this is a behavior that is really automatized within a person by this point. And that, so caving into it is kind of a natural thing. It can happen, particularly it's going to happen with forced abstinence in many, many cases, probably up to 80–90%. And if that's so common, then why would we shame people and guilt them? And so the idea is to accept them with open arms, reframe what happened, and to just show complete compassion. And that's really important, because if we look at the models out there, the two really competing models that we're talking about, there's this one that relies, and it's been around for 100 years at least, and it's, if you drink, you're an alcoholic. If you're an alcoholic, the consequence is you cannot drink anymore. You get forced abstinence. Forced abstinence, as we know, leads to the alcohol deprivation effect, probably 80–90% of the time, and then leads to the abstinence violation effect. I would venture almost 100% of the time. I don't think I've ever run into anybody that's had a relapse that didn't just go full tilt at it. And then, because the idea is that they know that, particularly with a treatment system that's based on progressive rewards and so forth for the behavior that they want, which is forced abstinence, you get rewarded for that. You get equally very punished for violating that. Go back down to the bottom again, start over. And that is not what we just saw is necessary with respect to the abstinence violation effect. And if we compare that with what we practice at TSM, first of all, the idea is that by targeting the behavior and the circuitry, and the fact that we use alcohol as part of the process, its chances of having the alcohol deprivation effect are dramatically decreased. And therefore, the abstinence violation effect doesn't come into play. But even if it does, and it can, okay, that somebody forgets to take the pill, or they don't redose, or whatever, that they get into an non-compliant situation and go, you know what, this is really fun, I'm going to just do it. And they do it. I mean, it does happen. They only do it a couple times, by the way. They usually come back and go, I don't want to do that again. But when it happens, we just tell people, hey, it's going to happen. You know, it's not the end of the world. Start over again. You know, take your pill, get out there. You haven't set the clock back to zero again, and off we go. So those are the kind of two competing models that we have there. And I think we know which one we prefer. I think you want to talk just a little bit about this, and then I think we're kind of almost out of time, so we probably, in fact, we're well over time. But I see a lot of questions out there, and I think we really do want to get to those. So if you've got any couple of wrap ups on these last slides.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the sort of take home messages are that again, when you ask yourself, do I have an addiction? You ask yourself where you are along those three dimensions, and that determines the kind of treatment that you need, the kind of help that you need. And I would say that a large part of recovery is just understanding the disorder that you have. I know when I use naltrexone to help people, I explain what addiction is to them and how the medicine works. And I get much better adherence with taking the medicine. So for me, doctors who just write for a script and think that's going to work, it generally doesn't, because there's still some folks who miss the getting high part. And if you don't explain how the getting high is just planting the seeds for the next episode where you're going to have to drink, then people think that it's okay to drink once in a while and get the high, and there's no cost to that. So you need to be able to explain what the mechanism is. You need to explain about neuroadaptation, and how your body needs the drug or the alcohol just to maintain normal functioning. And if you stop all at once, you're going to go through withdrawal. And so maybe there's medicines that can help with that where you don't need the alcohol or drug to take away the withdrawal symptoms. You can detox with effective medicines. There's the whole debate with abstinence versus moderation. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to various groups, and one group believes that abstinence is the only approach. And the idea of moderate drinking is so dangerous that to even say that, to say the word, is going to cause a lot of people out there to then sample alcohol and go back into their terrible addiction. And then we're going to talk about various ways to break the addictive cycle, to reduce the risk of relapse. And even when people are not drinking, I believe recovery still involves improvement in people's psychosocial functioning. Again, for me, addiction treatment is more than if you're drinking or not. For me, addiction recovery is that you're free of that vicious cycle. You're free to live your life, to be able to walk into a bar and not suffer severe craving, to be able to do everything that you used to do before you ever tried the alcohol. And so for me, that's what freedom is. And I think we're going to find that there's certain medicines that are really helpful to point in that direction, but there's also some important psychosocial treatments to help people sort of achieve a state of being free.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in great detail, but you talk about one thing that really sticks with me all the time, and that's this idea of being tethered. Okay, that all these solutions out there tend to tether people to something in the end, and that what we're pursuing with the idea of pharmacological extinction and then changing behaviors through psychosocial programs and learning and motivation, we untether that. I mean, there is the tether that if a person goes through this process, they're going to have to take naltrexone when they drink forever and ever. That's a pretty small tether compared to all the other tethers that we see, like going to meetings for the rest of your life, that sort of thing, or forced abstinence for that matter.
Yeah, and in the for opiate addiction, they really tether you because you have to show up at a clinic every day to get your methadone dose, or even people who are taking buprenorphine, try not taking your buprenorphine for a day or two, and you'll be running back to the clinic to get another prescription. So traditional treatment for addictions also it typically involve a tether, and we can talk about that a little bit if that's a problem, or for society a feature.
Okay, so let's see. You got some coming attractions. Okay, so we've got the next session's coming up. What can we expect to hear?
Well, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about how to break that addictive cycle. And spoiler alert, it involves naltrexone. We're going to talk about some historical perspectives and discovery of naltrexone to treat AUD, and maybe understand why it's not being used as much as we might hope. We'll talk about the absence violation effect, which we mentioned already. We'll talk about a model of addiction called the opponent process theory of addiction to help us understand why certain activities, certain drugs, why alcohol for certain people causes that vicious cycle, that vicious addictive cycle. We'll review some of the neurochemistry of learning, addiction, and how this can help us in terms of treatment. And ultimately, I think we'll learn some tools so that we can help change how we think about addiction, change the whole treatment paradigm. And what I'm hopeful is that you'll have those tools that you can talk to your family members about, talk to other people, maybe talk to people who you think could use help, but are not really ready to start help. Perhaps you can help them understand addiction in a new light so that they'd be more willing to come in and get the help that they need.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, let's, I see we've got a whole bunch of questions out there. I'm going to open up the floor. I'm going to start with Elizabeth. I'm going to ask you I'll ask you to unmute and go ahead and pose your question. Let me see.
Oh,
I have.
I typed it in the chat if that's all right.
Oh,
if you're
okay.
thinking
I
of
can read
me.
it for you if you want. That's no problem.
Sure.
Wanted to give you the opportunity, but I think you had two questions. It was, let's see here. Gotta get it.
Well, I could actually recap for you.
Yeah,
just
why
because
don't you?
it's
Because you had two.
fascinating.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
had two
this is
medical.
fascinating. One of the comments that I had earlier is, what are ways that TSM could get integrated into medical school curriculum, at least for future professionals? And I recall early in my career, I was on a project, the Robert Wood Johnson at Dartmouth Mary Hitchcock Hospital. And what they were doing was updating the medical school curriculum to ensure that doctors had a broader view of patient care. That was in 1992. And I wonder if initiatives like Robert Wood Johnson or something similar from a public health policy perspective could be helpful in getting information about TSM integrated into care. Because I know as a patient, and now I'm a woman in my early 50s, I know that most of the doctors and medical professionals that I've interacted with don't understand addiction at all, and that leads me to hide and not share information, and I'm probably not getting all of the health care that I need, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I don't want to go through all the efforts that I've taken to try to help educate people about addiction and about naltrexone in particular. When I was teaching at Penn, along with my mentor, Chuck O'Brien, we actually set up a very intensive course to treat the medical students about addiction. And I would give several lectures. We would have the students come over to our center where they could talk to patients. And I think the course got pretty good reviews. And some of those folks actually wound up doing a fellowship with us and went into the field. But over time, the number of lectures that we're allowed to give was more and more limited. And now I think they only have like 1 or 2 lectures on addiction. So then I turned my attention. I said, well, maybe we need to train primary care doctors about this. They're the ones who see people who have alcohol problems. Maybe we can train them to assess people. And even IEEE got involved with this, where there was a script written for primary care doctors, how to ask people about their drinking, and even using a couple of questions to help motivate people to do something about their drinking. And it was great on paper. And it worked when we did it in studies, that we could get doctors to ask patients about their patients drinking, and we could get more people into treatment. And when we found that in actual practice, and none of the doctors would ever use it. So then we talked to the insurance company and says, well, maybe the problem is they're not being paid to. So there was even a code that doctors can use, that if they ask people about addictions and other behavioral health problems, they could get extra money for the visit. And the doctors still won't do it.
Yeah.
And then I had a course for family practice doctors, where they would come to my clinic and they would spend a month at our center and learn how we treat addictions. And I tried to make the point that it's really not rocket science. It's pretty easy to do an outpatient detox, to start people on medicines, and people get better. And they actually got to see people over the course of the month who came in and they looked in terrible shape, and by the end of the month they looked great. And I showed them. I said, in my clinic, when we first moved there, the neighbors were all upset that addicts would be coming to the office building, and they were worried that their financial patients, the people who are trying to set up their IRAs and stuff, would be turned off because our patients would be outside smoking and throwing their cigarette butts all over the place, and there'd be addicts around. And I was so disappointed in about that. And it turns out over time, it wasn't our patients that were throwing the cigarette butts. It was the people going in to get their taxes looked at. And if you come into my waiting room, you can't tell that they have any addiction problems. They look like any medical office. And
Yeah,
my
great.
patients are getting better. They bring in their kids. It's perfectly fine. So it's really hard to get the medical profession to come around on this. They still have the belief that there's something fundamentally wrong with people who have addictions, and it's not a legitimate medical concern, despite the fact that every agency says it's a medical condition that's rightly within the purview of medical practice. So I get a lot of resistance about that. And so I tried convincing doctors, I tried medical schools. We had a fellowship, and we were able to train a couple of doctors who now go out and treat folks. But the traction has been really slow. So I'm hoping that the traction is actually going to come from the general public, that they're going to demand effective
Yeah,
treatment.
one of the things that, well, how I found out about TSM was actually from YouTube. So that is a way in which the world has changed significantly, right? There's a lady named Katie Lane from RIA Health who does a lot of videos on YouTube. That's
I've
how
talked
I
to
found
her.
out about this. Yeah.
She's great.
Well, yeah. So I was just thinking about that earlier in the conversation as I was just amazed at the politics of all of the definitions of alcohol use disorder over time, and that just it really affects how people get treated, and it's just really shocking to me. The other question that I had is a little bit more directly related to AUD, and that's how do you decide if TSM is working for you? You know, I'm in a place where I have significantly reduced my drinking in the last 3 months, but I'm also concerned that I've been doing a lot of damage to my body. And so I'm like, I hope extinction happens fast and faster because I really just don't want to be abusing my body anymore. But, you know, I don't know. How do you know when, I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to ask. It's, how do I decide when this is working, or if I need to just go to abstinence just to look out for my health, right?
So this is where I'm going to say that for purposes of this seminar, I'm not going to function as a doctor. I'm
That's
functioning
fair.
more,
That's
but
fair.
let me give you some general principles to ask yourself and see where you are. That if you're drinking at a level where if you were to stop drinking, you would have withdrawal symptoms, then it's pretty tough just to use the TSM as a way to get to the level that you want to be. Now, there is a narrow window, a thread that you could, where you gradually reduce your drinking over time and then get to extinction that way. My own bias is that if you have physiologic adaptation, if you have significant withdrawal symptoms, it's probably best to get that fixed first. And then you can use TSM as a way to keep your drinking under control if you do go out and drink. Now, having said that, I understand that for many people, the idea of detoxing seems like a pretty giant mountain to overcome, that you have to go to a doctor, you have to get medicine. Sometimes people think you have to go inpatient. It turns out it's not that difficult, that if you really understand it. And I spent 40 years trying to teach doctors how to do outpatient detox, and I even wrote protocols how to do it. It's not that hard at all. And so we need to teach the medical profession that your primary care doctor can write for some medicines that you can take over the course of 3 or 4 days and safely get off the alcohol, and then you can start your TSM.
Okay. That's really informative. And I'm looking forward to next week.
Great.
Great.
Excellent. Lisa, you had a couple of questions. I'm going to unmute you unless you want me to read them. think I'd ask you to unmute. Are you able to unmute, Lisa? Maybe I can find it. Maybe Lisa's not here. All right. We'll move on. Claire, how about you? You had a question. See if I can unmute you.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been a very informative hour and a half. I guess my question would be is that it's very clear from your very wonderful kind of presentation of the the evolution of the definitions of AUD from the DSM, the original DSM, through to DSM-5, that healthcare professionals and psychiatrists and psychologists, have, evolved their understanding of, what are the kind of determinants of addiction. So I guess my question would be, is like, why is it the fact that although there's this difference of understanding, that some of the same kind of prescriptions, especially like of how to help people along that that have AUD, these things like let them hit rock bottom, these things that I guess probably come from the big book. Why have those stood the test of time when the evidence base, has evolved so much?
I mean, that's a great question. And that's what I've been spending the last few years, 2 decades, trying to figure out. And what I can tell you is that there's a difference between what people think in the academic community and in actual clinical practice, and that's one of the reasons why I left Penn, because in the academic community, eventually over time, I wore people down. So they began to accept naltrexone was a good effective treatment. And then people were doing studies where they said, and the standard treatment naltrexone, which is hilarious to me because when it first came out, I was a heretic and people didn't believe the results. And now people are doing studies where they said, compared to the standard treatment naltrexone. So we won the battle there in the academic community, but it didn't cross over into the treatment community. And so I asked the question, why is that? And people would say things like, well, don't you know naltrexone has all these terrible side effects, or it's too expensive, or it really only works for a certain percent of people, a small percent of people, or its effects are modest at best. And I said, well, that's not what I find in my research. I don't know. Maybe there's something different in the clinical population. So I said, okay, let me set up a model treatment program. So I set up the Volpicelli Center, and I ran it just like a clinic, but it was based on using evidence-based treatment approaches. What I was doing in research, I just applied in a clinical setting, and I found the results were just as good in clinical practice as they were in the research studies. And so then I said, look, you can do this. And I still find resistance. And now I'm beginning to wonder what's the genesis of that resistance. And sometimes I wonder if the idea that naltrexone could be effective is offensive to certain people's models. And I think we'll get into this in one of the later lectures. And I'll talk about how people, in order to understand the world, they have certain models, they have certain narratives, certain stories about what something is. And they base their decisions based on that narrative. And sometimes it's really hard to get new information into that narrative. They have their own silos, and they listen to just data that's consistent with their silo. They almost actively resist new data. And
Confirmation bias.
yes, exactly. And the idea that naltrexone could be effective is a real challenge to people's models of what they think about addiction. And I'll just give you one example. I'll just give you one little taste. Most of the current definitions of addiction call it a chronic disease, chronic brain disease, chronic disease of character, whatever. It's chronic. It's a forever thing. Naltrexone, and the model that I use in my practice suggests that you can be free of it. The idea that you don't have to keep going to meetings if you don't want to. You're not tethered to a medicine that your body is physically dependent on. For some people, that's a really dangerous thing to say, because they think if patients in my treatment program were to hear this, they would drop out of treatment and immediately go on and abuse their drugs, abuse the alcohol. You can't get that message out there, or that's going to really interfere with the kind of treatment that we're doing for people. But if it works, and in my experience, it does work, that suggests that their model is wrong. And so if they were to accept naltrexone, they would have to admit their model of thinking about addiction is wrong. So it's hard for people to get to that point. So I've spent decades trying to convince them to integrate the use of naltrexone into their programs. And I've argued that you're going to get better results. I've argued that it's good to keep people in treatment. So you can still do all your good psychosocial stuff. You can still have all your meetings. Just give them naltrexone and they'll stay in treatment longer and they'll get better. None of that has had much of an impact because people think the idea of naltrexone should not work. I don't believe the results. The same thing that I had in the academic community in the early days, I'm finding in the treatment community. Where's the change going to come? I've tried insurance companies. I've tried showing data to clinicians. I've given speeches. I've done all sorts of things. And the best traction I'm getting right now is from people who are suffering with addiction themselves, who are suffering from alcohol problems, and they want an option. They say, I've tried this, I've tried that, and it's a struggle. All right, and even people who have 12 years sober, they'll still come up to me and say, but I'm still white knuckling it. God forbid, I have a wedding coming up and I'm dreading it because there's going to be alcohol around and I'm afraid that it's going to increase my craving and I'm going to slip up. And God forbid, if I have one drink, I'll be back to where I was. And so they're still struggling with it, even though they have years of sobriety. And I say, there's another option where you can be free of that. And that's where I'm getting some traction. And I have to say one other thing, and that is the opioid epidemic may be helping the field of addiction as well. And it's a sort of a subtle cultural thing, but if you look at alcohol but drugs in general, there's a certain sense that people who use the drugs, there's something wrong with them in some way. And it's sort of good to isolate those folks so that they don't contaminate regular society. But it's really hard to defend that position these days now because the opioid epidemic is affecting children, young adults in the suburbs. And so parents are coming to me and they say, I know my Jimmy is a good kid. He doesn't have any defect in his personality. He's not one of these kids who's a bad kid. It is the damn drug that got him hooked. And so they're looking for something that's going to free up their child so that they don't have to show up to methadone clinic every day. They don't have to be on a opiate agonist for the rest of their life. They want their old Jimmy back. And I say, here's an option for you. And so the sense that they have is that I'm looking for new treatments, I'm looking for new options, and naltrexone has a lot of appeal for them. So the change may come more from the grassroots, from people who are trying to get better and recover, as opposed from the treatment industry. So I'm sorry, let me get off my soapbox. Sometimes I do that. I apologize. Every once in a while I do that. And Steve, I hope in the future you'll bang me on the head or something.
No. I think
throw some water on me. But I'm sorry.
We're all on the same soapbox. I think you'll find. I was going to just add to that there's 145,000 deaths last year that were directly attributable to AUD. Forget about all the collateral stuff that's coded as something different. And there were 110,000 people that died from drug overdoses. So almost 40% more died from AUD. What's getting all the press is opioids. That's fine. I mean, if it drives the kind of treatments that we want and it makes naltrexone, more popular, it's wonderful, but it's just a wag the dog story. Lisa had a question around cravings, and she had put it in there for me to read, so I'm going to do that to you. It says, when it comes to cravings, how do you rate an ability to respond to a craving? I have felt cravings based on a feeling like I should be drinking right now as opposed to a physical craving. My response to craving feels impaired.
So I guess the question I would have for you is, do you feel compelled to drink, or is it more of an impulsive thing? So there are some people who start out during the day where they have no intention to drink, they don't have any particular craving, but they run into a situation where other people are drinking, and all of a sudden their craving increases, and there's no logical reason why. The next thing they know, they have a drink in their hand. We'll get into that over the course of the semester, why that occurs and how classical conditioning and other factors can cause that sort of thing. So it becomes something that's not even under sort of cognitive control. It's sort of an automatic reflex. So sometimes that happens. But if you do have the choice, if you're able to sit back and say, do I really want to drink or not? And you do a logical analysis and you weigh the pros and cons, and your logical brain says, I'd rather have the drink than not have the drink, and then that's something else. And that's not even addiction. So if logically you come to the conclusion that I'd rather have the drink and I know what the consequences are and I still want to drink, then that's your choice. But that's not addiction. Addiction involves that there's something that interferes with making the smart decision, the logical choice. So that's what I would ask you. Are you making a illogical choice or a logical choice? And if you're making an illogical choice, there's a lot of mechanisms that go into that as we shed light on that, it's going to be easier for you then to make the smart choice.
Exactly. That was, I said earlier, I'm going to be a bit pedantic about language. And that whole thing, like, for example, is it an impulse or is it compulsion? And I think it's really important to be able to understand the difference of those two and to analyze what you're feeling to see what the source of that is, because the solution may or may not be the same. But what's really important is the act of getting in touch with those feelings and really dissecting them. And alcohol, I think, just impairs our ability to do that. So that, when you start to get that clarity and then you start to really dig into it, the answer to your question, Lisa, will probably start to become clearer to you over time.
Lisa, I do want to tell you about a patient that I have who's actually doing TSM, and hopefully she's not in the room. Well, I will change some of the details so you can't identify her. I'll protect her identity. But this person has a pattern in her life where she would drink at the same time every day. Say it's 9 o'clock in the morning. And her drinking has been drastically cut down, but every day at 9 o'clock, she feels a compulsion to drink. And she has a whole ritual that she uses, a certain substance she mixes the alcohol in, so it has a certain taste. And she drinks, and she doesn't even particularly enjoy the alcohol so much, but it's still something that is hard for her to break. Now, when we analyze it, I think the pattern is that she would drink in the morning because she would be going all night without drinking. And when she would wake up first thing in the morning, she would have some mild withdrawal symptoms. And when she would drink, the alcohol would help take those away. And the drinking became associated with a whole context of things, the taste of the substance that she puts the alcohol in, the time of the day. It becomes part of her morning ritual. And so when she goes to bed, she says, I don't want to have any alcohol tomorrow. But the next day when she wakes up, the whole context, the whole ritual then stimulates the craving for her to drink. And before she knows it, it's sort of reflexive. She has the alcohol in her system. And that's a really tough thing to break. But as we begin to break it down, she begins to understand how she got in this situation. So she's at a point where she doesn't blame herself so much anymore when she drinks, because for a long time she would just get really upset with herself that she would slip up. What's wrong with me? Why don't I have enough willpower? So we've gotten past that point. And as we begin to shine a light on it, we can begin to understand factors to actually change that. So, but I think the most important thing is you stop blaming yourself and you start trying to understand what's going on. And for me, that's sort of the key of understanding addiction, is that we get away from blaming and more into understanding.
That's great. That's super. I've got a question from John. Wants to know how important it is to have a medical card in your wallet, as well as to educate your doctor that you take naltrexone, so that someone doesn't give you opioids. Say you're in an accident or something like that, and they want to give you pain reliever.
Yeah, we do that. And for a while we were giving people bracelets, and there was even like a necklace, and for a while there, my patients were like really proud to get the bracelet. When they would go on naltrexone, they say, "Where's my bracelet?" And when they would go to certain meetings, they would say, "See, I had the bracelet," and at those meetings they would be rewarded for it and say, "Good job." So I like to see it reach that point, but it is useful to make sure you tell your doctor that you're on naltrexone, because if they do give you opiates for pain, the opiates aren't going to work. Now, it's not going to kill you, but you're not going to feel better from the opiates. The pain might do you damage. And if they know that you're taking naltrexone, there's ways to deal with the pain where you could use certain kinds of opiates that can bypass the naltrexone and still get some pain relief. So there's a lot of ways to deal with it, but your doctor needs to know that to more effectively treat you.
So it's a good idea, especially
to
have some. Yeah, great. Okay, and let's see. We've got a question from Karen. Do you feel like there's a significant amount of opposition to TSM from those associated with traditional rehab centers threatening the revolving cash register? I'm sorry, door.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's worth a whole session talking about that. And working with someone, we're writing a book to talk about that sort of thing. But I want to be careful what I say, because I think I have many friends in the addiction treatment community who are incredibly motivated and caring and want to help people. And a lot of the clinicians that I see, they are some of the most dedicated folks that I know. Unfortunately, some of them work for companies that are more concerned with the bottom line in terms of making a profit or not. And so sometimes the line staff that are actually doing the working with the patients are not getting very much support from the people who are running the programs, and that's so disappointing for me. I am not opposed to a company making money. I'm not. It's important. If my Volpicelli Center didn't make enough money, I wouldn't be able to pay the staff that works there. So a company needs to be able to make money, and a company needs to make money to generate other companies to want to go into the field. So it's a good thing that companies make money. But you don't want a company that's so greedy that puts the bottom line ahead of people getting better. And I think that it's a win-win-win situation when a company provides good, effective treatment, and they can keep people in treatment longer, and they can make a profit. And I think there's ways to do that. But you have to look at the long-term perspective. You can't just look at what's the bottom line for this week or this quarter. You have to look at what's going to be most helpful in the long run for the field and the long run for the folks that you're treating. But again, that's we can spend some time talking about that. It's something I've been doing a lot of thinking about, and I'd be really interested to get other people's feedback on that, because I don't have all the answers for sure.
Yeah, and we actually are going to address that with meetup number 7, I believe it is changing the paradigm. Okay, and if we have to have two meetups to change the paradigm, or 4 meetups, that's plenty good. It's a good topic for us to tackle. Let's see, we've consumed a bunch of your time here this evening, and I want you in good shape for the remaining 7 series. I'm gonna pick out one more question here, and then I will make sure that we carry over these questions and address them. I saw one up here. This one was from Joe. And it had, Joe, if you're still there, I'm going to unmute you. This was the one where you're asking about how do you know if you're actually dependent?
Well, yeah. Hi, nice to meet you. So you had mentioned earlier, and it just kind of struck a bit of a chord with me. You were saying it might be hard to thread the needle if you were on TSM when in fact you had alcohol dependence or physical dependence. I've had AUD for 15 years. I would assume if anybody had some sort of dependence, that would be me. But I don't necessarily get the shakes in the morning or anything, this type of thing. So how do I know if TSM's a fit for me if that's the case?
So some of the things that I would look for in general are if your pattern of drinking is that you drink every day. Let me ask you that: do you drink every day?
I'm a daily drinker, yes.
Daily drinker. And when you drink, about how many drinks do you have in a day?
I mean, I don't know, 6 to 8.
6 to 8. So again, not medical advice, but for many people who have that level of drinking, it's quite likely that if you were to stop all at once, you would have some withdrawal symptoms. And so what makes TSM complicated is that if it was really effective and you went from, say, 8 drinks a day to 2 drinks a day, it's possible that the next time you drink, you would have mild withdrawal. And so what would happen to you if you drank under those conditions? So the naltrexone would be really effective in blocking the high associated with drinking, but not effective at all in blocking the effect of alcohol to take away the withdrawal. So your brain will be getting 2 messages. One is, I'm not getting reinforcement from the high, which is going to lead to extinction, but it's also going to get a message that alcohol is working really well to take away the withdrawal, which is positive reinforcement. So it helps to maintain the behavior, not because you don't get the high anymore, but you're taking away the bad feelings of the withdrawal. And the withdrawal doesn't have to be terrible shakes, sweating. It can be more mild symptoms, like some people interpret it as anxiety. For example, I have people that I talk to who do the dry January, and they would not consider themselves to have AUD. They have 4 or 5 drinks or so, and what they report is that when they cut back on their drinking, they after a period of heavy drinking, the next day they feel crappy. They feel more anxious. They even call it hangxiety. It's part of the hangover. And so there could be subtle withdrawal symptoms that the alcohol is still effective in taking away. And so you're still getting reinforcement for the behavior. So you're not getting a true extinction session. So if you have a pattern of daily drinking, and if you find that you're not making as quick progress as you would hope, maybe part of the mechanism is that you're still getting some reward from the drinking because of its effect in terms of helping to block or take away withdrawal symptoms.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. What to do?
Again, not giving medical advice to you, but you need something that's going to block the withdrawal symptoms. And fortunately, there's a variety of medicines that can do that. So if you get a doctor to prescribe some oxazepam or Neurontin or Dopamax or something like that takes away the withdrawal, then you won't need the alcohol to take away withdrawal anymore. I mean, I guess if I was really smart, I would design a pill that had the naltrexone and some medicine that takes away withdrawal, and you just take that, and then you have both mechanisms covered, and maybe we'll get faster extinction. Now,
I
if I told that to David Sinclair, he'd be patenting that idea, and it'd be out on the market. But that would be the idea, to something like that.
It's kind of like Contrary, right?
Thank you, doctor.
Contrave is Wellbutrin and
Right.
naltrexone. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
So yeah, it should be, if you have two medicines that are already FDA approved, when you mix them together, it should be pretty easy to get the FDA approval. Or you get your doctor to write for both medicines. Something like that. I mean, again, that would be a great experiment to try. Normally what I do is I just say, okay, let's take a week and detox. And so I'm a fan of ripping off the Band-Aid. Let's just get rid of the withdrawal first, and then we can deal with the high second. So, but some people are not a rip off the Band-Aid kind of folk, and they want to do it gradually. And that would be the way to do it gradually.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Great. Great. Joe, we could go on all night. We're going to go on for months here, but I don't want to keep you too late. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for all the time you spent just in preparing this and making yourself available to me and to other folks. It's just really wonderful. Thank you to all of you who came this evening. And I truly hope that you'll come to all the series. There probably won't be a final exam, but I can't promise you that. And yeah, so with that, I think we can wrap this up for the evening. Thank you all, and hope to see you here at the next session.
Sounds great.
Great.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.